me that your home was built in 1910. So just imagining the history that's here where we stand right now at this very historic moment for this country. The test that we are under that is unlike any other that any American has experienced. If you think about all of the challenges that we face right now, in healthcare, tens of millions who can't see a doctor or afford a prescription or go to a mental health care provider, only to be well enough to do what they were put on this planet in the first place to do. When we think about public school education in Iowa, in my home state of Texas, a teacher shortage provoked by preventing those same teachers from organizing and being able to use the leverage of the value that they provide in the classroom, and to us to be able to be paid a living wage, to have working conditions that are conducive for them, and most especially for those kids. And the beneficiary of these policies in this state, after we broke up teachers' right to organize, is Minnesota, which has seen a windfall in calculus and physics teachers coming from this state that you paid to educate and put in the classroom and are now going somewhere else. An economy that works really well in this country for few of our fellow Americans, and not at all for far too many. Not just school teachers, but Americans of every walk of life working 2 or 3 jobs just to try to make ends meet right now. $7.25 is not going to cut it for anyone anywhere unless they work 2 or 3 jobs at $7.25 an hour. You have a system of immigration which has consigned millions of our fellow Americans, including dreamers who came here at a very young age, who know no other country but this one, do not speak the language in their home country, are every bit as American as anyone else, and yet they live in a constant fear of deportation back to a place where if they're successful there against those long odds, they'll be successful for that place and not this place. Hey. Yeah, that's not unconditional. And the solution to that challenge, to every single challenge, is within us as a country. We are a great people born to do great things. As Truman reminded us, we were not founded on fear. Instead, we were built on courage, on imagination, on an unstoppable determination to do the job at hand. If it's meeting the challenge of healthcare by guaranteeing universal, high-quality care to every single American, certainly the wealthiest, the most powerful, the most medically and technologically advanced place on the planet can come up with the solutions. If it is an economy that works for all by ensuring that we have a living minimum wage so that one job is enough for every single one of us, certainly we can come up to the answer to that. If it is immigration reform, I know that Republicans and Democrats and independents alike can sit at the same table and find the common ground to pursue the common cause, a solution that works for everyone, not just those immigrant families, but communities like this one in my hometown of El Paso, Texas, whose very strength and success, and yes, safety and security is premised on the fact that we are a people of the world over who have found a home here in the United States of America. And perhaps the largest challenge that we face, especially for the little people who are with us right now, the fact that this planet has warmed 1 degree Celsius just since 1980 over pre-industrial revolution levels, and that warming, produced by us, not by God nor by Mother Nature, is responsible for the flooding that we've seen along the banks of the Missouri, the flooding that we are seeing along the banks of the Mississippi, the 58 inches of rain that fell from the sky, which is the landfall record for a single storm in all of recorded history in North America, hit Houston, Texas in 2017, and was the third 500-year flood in that community's last 5 years. The fires that we're seeing in California, following historic droughts and infestations of beetles, producing the tinder to create the worst devastation that state has seen, including the loss of life in communities like Paradise, California, and to the firefighters who we send in to harm's way. These droughts, these floods, these storms, these fires are going to get exponentially worse for the generations that follow ours. The places that we live today and take for granted will no longer support human life in so many cases, unless within the next 10 years, which is what scientists say that we have left to us to get this right and to do the right things, we do everything within our power, defy the differences between us, find the common ground upon which to operate to save this planet for the generations that will succeed ours. Right here in Iowa, we have so many solutions to the challenges that we face. I was just in Pacific Junction, a community in which every single home was underwater completely. Every possession inside of those homes lost to those owners forever. The homes in many cases will not be able to be rebuilt. We visited a home built in 1908, 2 years before yours. So many families had lived there. The family that was living there before that flood hit has to acknowledge that that home cannot be saved, cannot be rebuilt. It is gone forever. Talking to a Republican state representative in that community, he talks about the need to invest in the infrastructure along the Missouri River because he knows that this last flood was precipitated by 4 times the average runoff into the Missouri River Basin from an average year. In fact, the greatest runoff since we've been keeping records on the Missouri River, and it will continue to flood going forward. So investing in the resiliency of our communities, pre-disaster mitigation grants from the federal government to match what you're doing here in Iowa, that is something that can bring Republicans and Democrats alike together. Listening to farmers who are already doing so much, not just to feed this state, this country, but the planet, who also want to be able to plant cover crops, to pull more carbon out of the air and inject it in the soil. They want to be able to use precision tilling or no-till farming to disturb less of the carbon that is already there. They want to be paid for the public good that they provide by conserving land so that they do their part, or even more of their part, for this planet. At the same time that we as a country decide that we will invest more in your lead here in biofuels and wind energy and what we're doing in El Paso, Texas with solar, transitioning this economy, this country, and ultimately the world off of fossil fuels. If every single one of us does our part, everything that we can in the decade that is left to us, then maybe, just maybe, we keep this planet from warming 2 degrees Celsius. And these kids, my oldest Ulysses, 12 years old, in the year 2050, he'll be 6 years younger than I am right now. And he'll be looking back on us, the people of 2019 and 2020, to see how we acquitted ourselves when we knew the science, the facts, and the truth, and the solution to the challenges that we faced. What did we do? Did we bury our heads in the sand? Did we say it was too tough, too expensive? Or did we get after it and follow Truman's words and show this challenge our courage, our imagination, and our unstoppable determination? My bet is on America. It is on this country and our ability to come together to face these challenges, to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050, to be halfway there by the year 2030, and not doing it through one person or one president or one political party, but this very divided, highly polarized, hyper-partisan country finally coming together for the common good. Let me give you a brief overview of why I think I can be helpful in this mission. As a former small business owner in El Paso, Texas, creating high-value, high-wage, high-skilled jobs in a community that desperately needed them, I know what it's like to be able to unleash talent that was waiting to express itself if only given the chance. I know what it's like to meet a payroll week in and week out, to hustle for our clients, to always be on the clock, to be able to deliver excellence to those who have entrusted us. As a member of the El Paso City Council for 6 years, a nonpartisan elected position where I was neither a Democrat nor a Republican, but just an El Pasoan, tasked with delivering for my constituents, we did. Balancing the budget, paying our police and fire, ensuring that we focused on economic development for all of our fellow El Pasoans, and never shying away from the tough fights. Like in 2009, passing an ordinance that extended health care benefits to the same-sex partners of city employees, regardless of the recall elections that followed that decision. It was the right thing to do for my fellow El Pasoans. As a member of Congress, after winning an election against the odds and against the incumbent, learning that El Paso had the longest wait times for veterans to see a mental health care provider in the United States of America, and that care delayed became care denied, and was connected to a suicide epidemic amongst veterans. We're losing 20 of them a day, every single day in this country. We singularly focused on that problem, made it an opportunity for our community, brought everyone together, and hired up so that we went from 68 full-time mental health care staff at the El Paso VA to just under 120 today, opening up more appointments, getting more care to more veterans, and in the process, saving more lives. We took those lessons from El Paso, and though a member of the minority in Congress for every 6 years, expanded mental health care access for veterans nationally, and got it signed into law by someone with whom I agree on almost nothing, Donald Trump, and yet found enough common ground there to do the common good for those who would put their lives on the line for this country. We use that same strategy to protect public lands in Texas, to invest in our connections with Mexico, to make us safer so that we know who and what is coming into this country, at the same time that we facilitate trade and travel upon which your state here in Iowa depends. And then lastly, we just ran a statewide campaign in Texas, visiting every single one of the 254 counties. No matter how blue and big, we would not take you for granted. We showed up to find out what was on your mind and to listen to your questions. No matter how red or small, we did not write you off. We went to places that Democrats for decades had feared to tread and did not show up. And because there was no natural competitor, Republicans didn't have to show up either, and those folks were functionally unrepresented in their own democracy. So that when we went to a place like Archer County, where Larry McMurtry wrote Lonesome Dove and The Last Picture Show, and I'm walking into Mern's Cafe to hold a town hall with all of 11 or 12 people, 20 if you include the innocents who were having breakfast when we walked in that day. A gentleman stops me, and he's got a manila envelope, and he pulls out a black and white photo, and he shows me a picture of his dad talking to Congressman Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was campaigning in Archer County in 1948. And he told me that his dad had lived in Archer County his entire life. He had lived in Archer County his entire life, and there had not been a Senate candidate from either party since then to show up in Archer County. It had been 70 years since someone showed up to ask them what was on their mind, to ensure that their stories were reflected in a campaign and in the service that we wanted to provide. So showing up for everyone, everywhere, not writing anybody off, not taking anyone for granted, can prove to be a successful campaign strategy and a successful strategy to provide the service that we want to deliver for the people of America. And let me tell you about the results. Though we did not win the race, we were 2.6% down from Ted Cruz at the end of the night in November. We gained more votes than any Democrat in the history of the state of Texas. We saw young voter turnout up 500% from the last midterm election. We won independence for the first time in 10 years. Republicans, bless you, and bless Democrats too. 500,000 Republicans who voted for Greg Abbott for governor. Republican, conservative, Tea Party, close ally of Donald Trump, voted for us on the same ballot without us ever having to trim our sails or say anything other than what was on our minds, showing up with the courage of our convictions on every single important issue. And the kicker is, not only did we help 2 new Democratic members of Congress to win their elections, helping to flip the House of Representatives, not only did we help to change the composition of our state legislature, not only did we help 17 African American women to win their elections to judicial positions of prominence in Houston, Texas, the most diverse city in the United States of America, literally changing criminal justice in that community in the process. My mom, a lifelong Republican, also voted for me in that 2018 election. So we know that we are on to something. And that's the same approach that we're taking today here in Iowa, in the 13 other states that we visited over the last 6.5 weeks, showing up everywhere for everyone, taking no one for granted, writing nobody off, making sure that everybody sees a future for themselves in this democracy and in our country. And so for that, I'm grateful to you for hosting us here today, for spending part of your Tuesday morning with us, for asking some great questions and giving me some great guidance on how we can do the best possible job for all Americans. Thank you all for being here today and for having me out. Very grateful. Appreciate it. Cynthia Cano has a microphone, and if you've got a question or a comment, she will bring it out to you.
Okay, I'm gonna go you first.
Thank you. I have a question. In terms of when I talk to fellow Democrats, I ask, who are you favoring in this enormous number of people who are running for office? Inevitably, the final line, bottom line, is I'm going to support somebody who can beat Trump. Why are you that person?
Yeah. So, at a moment that this president, for whatever his motivation, has trained the focus of this country on the U.S.-Mexico border. He's called Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals, though we know they commit crimes at a far lower rate than those born in this country. He's caged kids who are fleeing brutality and violence from the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today, after first describing them as animals and infestations to the United States of America. He's threatened to cancel our trading relationships with our closest trading partners, to whom we are literally connected by land. At that point of his focus, I'm raising my family with my wife, Amy. I just represented 750,000 of my fellow fronterizos, or border residents, in the United States Congress, born and raised in one half of the largest binational community on the face of the planet, a city that is now one of, if not the safest cities in the United States of America, not despite the fact that a quarter of those with whom we live were born somewhere else, but because a quarter of those with whom we live were born somewhere else, chose us, investing their genius and their future in this country. I think I can tell a very powerful, positive story about the role of immigrants, not just in my hometown of El Paso, not just here in Adel, but in every single part of this country. And I can do it from experience. Having just run in a red state, and though we came up a little bit short in our race, helping to produce some of those changes that I just described, I think shows you, I hope, that we can compete everywhere in this country. And we do it not by demeaning or denigrating somebody based on their party or their geography or what they do for a living, but bringing everybody in, lifting them all up, and including them in the conversation. And in that example that I gave you of my time in Congress, finding the common ground with the Republican leadership to help those who had served our country, veterans in the example that I gave, and ensuring that we do not allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. This is going to be the mother of all tests for our country. Will we choose racism, a meanness and a pettiness and a smallness, a fear of the rest of the world that literally plans to build 2,000 miles of wall to connect us, to separate us from those countries to whom we are literally connected right now? Or will a vision of ambition and aspiration and a call to service and sacrifice to achieve our goals win the day ultimately? That's the platform upon which we are running. You will ultimately decide the question that you asked, but I think I bring some unique qualities and experiences and skills to this conversation, to this race, and hopefully as the next nominee. Thanks for asking. Appreciate it.
So could you talk a little more about our state is so highly agricultural, and it's so invested in Monsanto and corn and beans versus diversity. And I like your message that there is an answer out there to carbon sequestration, but we got a long ways to go. And conservation programs, I hope, are a part of that. So could you talk a little bit more about your vision for converting agriculture in the state, to a more of a positive, less hypoxia or addressing hypoxia problem?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for asking the question. To help answer your question, I turn to and listen to the farmers of this state who have come up with the solutions time and again. Ethanol is one great example of that, of farmers not only freeing themselves from a dependence on commodity markets over which they had no control, adding even greater value to what they grow, but also freeing ourselves from an overdependence on oil and gas, and beginning that process more than 40 years ago, right here in this state. Talking to farmers yesterday, there was this idea that I really like, that right now the federal government essentially encourages practice-based farming. You will farm in the following ways, do the following things. And they suggested, what if we turn the tables and put the farmer in the driver's seat and have performance-based encouragement and incentives. In other words, we want to capture this much carbon per acre. You're the farmer, you understand how to do this better than anybody else. You bring up the ingenuity, the innovation, your hard work and diligence, and then we will reward you based on performance. I really like that a lot. That might be an encouragement to plant cover crops. That might be an encouragement to crop rotation, which is not good for Monsanto or the big agribusiness firms, but is great for the farmer and might in some ways unlock that dependence that farmers have, planting small grains in rotation if they are allowed to, and this is all that I've ever heard any farmer asked to do, if they are allowed to make a profit in the process. Visiting those farms outside of Pacific Junction that are now lakes at this moment, what I heard from farmers is that they were already underwater in debt. They are now literally underwater from the flooding of the Missouri River. All that they want to be able to do is make a profit on that land. And right now, the encouragement, the inducements, the incentives say to plant soybeans and corn and to plant every single inch that you have under your control. If we provided a profit for conservation, if we provided a profit for cover crops, if we provided a profit for crop rotation, farmers would rise to that challenge as they always have. And everything that I just said to you came from the mouths of farmers that I've listened to across Texas and across Iowa. So I want to make sure that in the next iteration of the Farm Bill, that bill is written in large part by the farmers who will be disproportionately impacted by the provisions within it. So these are some of the ways that we can meet our food, our fiber needs, our fuel needs, and our ability to ensure that we capture enough carbon out of the atmosphere to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. A performance-based farm policy instead of a practice-based farm policy. Thanks for asking.
Okay, this is a little different question, but are you worried at all about Russian interference? Because we can go to all this work at figuring out who we want to run against Trump. The Russians interfere. Where do we stand? I mean, I worry about it. I don't know if you do.
Thank you. I do as well. And there's cause for worry because beyond the shadow of a doubt, we now know, in part thanks to the Mueller report, that Russia invaded our democracy in 2016. They manipulated voter opinions using the social media platforms that so many of us rely upon to form our opinions, get the information, to cast our votes, or to come to the conclusions about a given candidate or a given policy. More troubling is that the president still denies that that has taken place, and when confronted with the choice of believing our intelligence community, our country, or Vladimir Putin, on that stage in Helsinki, Finland, he chose Putin. His love affair with Putin, with Kim Jong-un, who he literally said he is falling in love with strongmen and dictators the world over, turning his back on our fellow Western democracies, the NATO alliance, inviting more provocative measures from Russia, who has already invaded Georgia and Crimea and Ukraine, has a presence in Syria, is involved in Venezuela right now. This is a national security issue for us, on top of an issue of the security and sanctity of our ballot box and our democracy. After the Mueller report is released, President Trump spends 1 hour on the telephone with Vladimir Putin and calls the Russia investigation a hoax. Now, what signal or message is Vladimir Putin going to take from that? Who cares what a member of Congress says? Who cares what any of us say? if the leader of the free world is giving him an open invitation to continue to involve himself in our elections, then we are all at risk right now. This brings up a question that's on a lot of people's minds right now. What are the consequences for this president's invitation to further invasion in our democracy from Russia? George Will, noted conservative columnist, said if you wondered whether there was collusion when the Trump campaign, in whatever ham-handed way they did, met with representatives of the Russian government, when President Trump, in broad daylight, asked the Russian government to find Hillary Clinton's emails, there could be no doubt in your mind when he was on that stage with Vladimir Putin, and George Will calls that collusion in action. If you wondered whether there was obstruction of justice when the president fired the principal investigator into what happened in 2016, James Comey, the director of the FBI, when he tweets in broad daylight to Jeff Sessions, his attorney general, to end the Russian investigation, there can be no doubt that that is obstruction of justice, clear as day. And if there are not consequences and repercussions, accountability and justice, not only have we invited the Russians to continue to involve themselves in our democracy, we have set a green light for Trump or any one of his successors to abuse this democracy, the single greatest mechanism that humankind has ever invented to call forth the genius of a given people. And so our democracy, the very foundation of our country's success, is at risk right now. And there has to be further investigations from Congress. Impeachment proceedings make sense so that the facts are presented to the American people, to their representatives in the United States Senate, and then the best decisions made for the future of this country, I hope, are rendered by those in these positions of public trust. So yes, it concerns me very much, and unless we take decisive action, we are inviting more of that coming forward. Thank you for the question.
Of the many phone calls that I get from the many candidates that we have, the first question is inevitably, what is my most important thing to worry about? What's your...
Climate. If we do not take bold action right now, if we do not sustain it and increase that through the next 10 years, we lose this place for the generations that follow ours. When we take the long view and don't care about the polls, don't even worry about our prospects in the next election, but instead think about the next generation, we cannot help but focus on that challenge. There were 400,000 apprehensions at the southern border last year. To put it in perspective, in the second year of the George W. Bush administration, there were 1.6 million apprehensions. So there is no crisis on the border. There's a crisis for some of those families who just traveled 2,000 miles, but we as a country are doing okay. But if 400,000 apprehensions worries you or anybody else, we know that increasingly those apprehensions include farmers from Honduras who are trying to persist in the face of historic droughts in that country. What they are planting is no longer growing. Soon enough along this trajectory, some of those countries will no longer support or sustain human life. At that point, 400,000 is going to be a drop in the bucket compared to what we will see arrive on the US-Mexico border. The competition for resources in a warming planet is going to be absolutely fierce. And I fear the judgment of Ulysses and Molly and Henry, our three kids. I fear the judgment of your daughter. I fear the judgment of the generations that will follow us, the people of the future, who will look back on 2019 and 2020 and know full well that we had all the evidence and the facts and the science in front of us. All that we had to do was to muster the political will to make those decisive, bold choices right now. So that, to me, is the singular challenge that we have as a country, as a planet. Thanks for asking.
Thanks for coming. Thank you. So I teach at Simpson College, where you were at last night. I wasn't. I said the students. I'm the advisor of the Democrats, and I told them that they could have their night. But you met some great students of mine.
Yeah.
So I'm concerned with everything you're saying, but I'm really concerned with higher ed. But what I'm most concerned with is that I don't seem to hear any plan from any candidate beyond some version of let's make this free. And as someone who like kind of is in that world, let's make it free is actually not going to really do that much. I'm seeing people don't think they need an education anymore. Students are working so hard, they have so many mental health issues that they cannot function in classrooms, that their families are struggling at home, so they can't come to class because they have to go home and take care of disabled parents or things like that. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about what, knowing it's a state issue, but what can the federal government do besides simply keep giving loans or grants?
Yeah.
Oh, also, I'm going to El Paso to do immigration research next week, so if after you could give me a restaurant recommendation, I'll put it.
So first of all, the town hall that we held at Simpson was phenomenal, made so by Jeff and Natasha. So you're doing a great job with those two young leaders. Jeff, I understand, is a debate champ. Yeah, amazing. Really great questions came up, including a version of the question that you just asked. I'll answer in the context of an article that I read this morning that says that Iowa's economic growth is imperiled by the fact that we're not creating the trained workforce for the jobs that are opening up here. So you're not going to be able to attract more employers or expand employment in this state if you do not have the human capital necessary to do that. What's the delta? We're not educating that workforce. I talk about folks who are working 2 and 3 jobs. One of the ways to ensure that they work just one job is greater educational attainment. We know beyond the shadow of a doubt that is correlated with earning potential over the course of your life. So yes, making community college free so that you get at least an associate's degree, that next level of skills, that allows you to command that living wage and to fill those jobs that we're creating. Empowering unions in a state that unfortunately has been weakening the strength of unions over time. Those apprenticeships, those trades, those skills that young people and older people whose jobs have been automated out of existence learn debt-free, the protections that they enjoy, the improvements that are distributed to the greater public. Unions are a big part of the challenge of education. Sometimes we only talk about community college or 4-year universities or graduate degree programs, and we leave out unions, which are absolutely fundamental to the success that this country has enjoyed historically. For 4-year universities, yes, students, especially those who come from families of means, will need to pay their way, but they need to be able to do that without taking on the crushing debt burden that we're seeing right now. There is $1.5 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, and there's a default rate of about 10%, so we know that this is not working. At the same time that the federal government is making tens of billions of dollars in profit on the interest payments on those loans, we should not be making money on the backs of students who are just trying to improve themselves to be capable of teaching in school or working in the VA or being the civil engineers or the trained technicians or skilled workers that we need in our economy. So bringing those interest rates down to a level that is more manageable for those who have existing loans is a step. And then also clearing the debt for those who are willing to dedicate some part of their lives to public service. So if you have a teacher shortage in Iowa, and you do, and you are someone who's just graduated with debt, wants to teach, I want to ensure that you can afford to do that, but wiping clear and clean the debt that you hold. There are 45,000 unfilled positions in the VA today, clinical positions, 45,000 across this country, which helps to explain wait times at the VA that sometimes are measured not in minutes or hours, but weeks and months to be able to see a provider for care that you have earned. If you're willing to work at the VA, let's wipe clean that debt that you have right there. So I think unions, apprenticeships, free community college, debt-free 4-year universities are all part of the way to meet that gap in the trained workforce that we need to reduce that student debt burden. And to answer that question that you say some people are asking, which is, why should I go to college? Why should I take on this debt? Let's make that an easy decision for people to make. Thank you. And when you're in El Paso, there is a great diner on the corner of Mesa and California called Lucy's. And they make this dish called machaca. And machaca is shredded beef that's fried with eggs, onions, peppers, jalapenos, and then it's put on a plate with hash browns, refried beans, and then it is draped with chili con queso. And it is, if it doesn't stop your heart, it'll make your life that much better. So.
All right, I have time for 2 more.
Good morning, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
You have really most impressively described your leadership skills from your background. It's very impressive. Talk to us about your management plan, about what kind of management style you have when you are elected and on that first day as you start to take control.
Yeah. Thank you. When Amy and I made the decision to run for Congress in 2012, we knew it was a long shot. We were going up against an 8-term incumbent who outspent us 5-1 in the race. And we also had and still have a very young family, very young at that point. I think Henry was a year old. And one of the considerations, should we be so fortunate enough to win, that Amy and I discussed was, how long do we want to do this? And I don't know how to put this in terms other than those used by Amy, but she said, I just don't want you to be a jerk. I don't want you to go up to Washington, D.C., think you're this important guy, lose your connection with the person that I fell in love with this community from which you came. And she said, it's hard to escape when you meet other, not everybody, members of Congress or elected leaders who've been there forever, that they think they're more important than everybody else. And so really out of that conversation, we adopted a term limits pledge to make sure that if we were elected and re-elected, we would not stay there forever. One of the best, and we took that pledge, and I ended up serving 3 terms in Congress. And one of the best consequences of that is that the woman who succeeded me in office after I didn't overstay my welcome, Veronica Escobar, is the first Hispanic woman to be elected to a congressional district in the state of Texas, which is awesome. But knowing that we were going to be there for a limited time, we had to answer your question. What are we going to do with this limited time? And so we very carefully picked our priorities. We knew that there was a crisis in veterans care in El Paso. As I said earlier, we had the worst mental health care wait times in the country. So we were going to make that job number one, because literally veterans were dying in line to see a provider. And we didn't even wait for action from Congress. We marshaled the resources in the community. And I say we, I didn't marshal the resources. The community, when we identified the challenge, came together. Private providers, public providers, all wanting to make sure that we deliver for those veterans. And we did, and I'm very, very grateful to be part of that. The second priority was to make sure that Fort Bliss, home to the 1st Armored Division, 32,000 active duty service members, was fully supported from our position on the Armed Services Committee. And we really made sure that we delivered and followed through. Our third priority, the U.S.-Mexico border that facilitates billions of dollars in trade connected to jobs in my community, connected to jobs in your community, working with John Cornyn, our Republican senior U.S. Senator, to make sure that we got the necessary investments there. And then fourth priority, in terms of public policy, protecting public lands. We had 7,000 acres of Chihuahuan desert wildlife owned by the Department of the Army that was going to be sold, potentially developed for commercial or industrial use, and we were going to lose it forever. We implored the Obama administration to make this a national monument, and unfortunately we were unable to prevail. And so we went to Plan B, and as a member of the House Armed Services Committee, included protection for those 7,000 acres in perpetuity in the National Defense Bill. And that too was signed into law by Donald J. Trump. Now, at a time that he was shrinking the size of national monuments and protected public lands, he increased them by 7,000 acres in my hometown. He probably doesn't know that he did that was in the bill, so don't anyone tell him. And then I'll tell you this one last thing. Cynthia Cano, who is with the microphone right here, was my district director in El Paso. So she ran the show for our constituents, those 750,000 fellow El Pasoans who placed me in this position of public trust. Any one of them who had any challenge interacting with the federal government, a veteran who couldn't get into the VA or was waiting on an appeal to a first-time service-connected disability claim, folks who were trying to untangle the red tape from the IRS or the State Department on a visa, they went to our office and we tracked every single customer interaction. And after we finished handling your case, we asked you, how did we do? And we religiously tracked those. And if you gave us anything other than a great or good rating, you got a call from me or from Cynthia to find out how we could do a better job next time. I tell you all that to tell you that we were very focused on our priorities, constantly measured ourselves to see how we were doing, would not go back to my constituents and say, listen, folks, I know we had these priorities, but I'm in the minority party. Those darn Republicans just won't let us get that done. That was never going to be an option. We had to find a way to work with the Republicans to deliver for those that I cared for. And that was all possible by building the greatest team that I've ever been a part of. And so I understand that were I to be your president, there's nothing unique about me that would allow me to deliver on all these things that we just talked about today. It would be incumbent upon me to form the greatest team possible and to bring forth, the genius and the skills and the experience necessary to deliver to our priorities. So that's a little bit about our management history. Thank you very much.
This is our last question.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Income and wealth distribution inequality in America is vast. Systematically, we've kind of talked about some mechanisms to remedy that. Do you have particular ideas, particular mechanisms to remedy that?
Yeah. Agree with the premise of the question. We're seeing the greatest level of wealth and income inequality in the United States of America since the last Gilded Age. And my hope is, in the same way that former moment of concentration of power and wealth and privilege provoked a progressive response, that this moment will also provoke a progressive response. Because I think one of the truths of our democracy is that in order for this idea to work, that is the exception in world history and on the planet today, this idea that we should be able to freely choose our representatives and collectively determine the course of this country. For us to have true political democracy, we must also have economic democracy. When we can't see a shared or common future for our kids in the future of this country, then we stop participating, being involved, or believe in this idea or this ideal. Theodore Roosevelt said something to that effect. He said, in that last progressive response to the Gilded Age, he said, if we hope to achieve political democracy, we must vigorously pursue economic democracy. So how do we do that at this moment? I mentioned earlier a minimum wage that is a living wage. $15 an hour should be the floor for any job, because I want you to be able to work that one job with everything that you've got, but I also want you to be able to read to your daughter before the first day of kindergarten, every night during first grade, to ensure that she has your attention to achieve to her full potential over the course of her life. I want to make sure that if you need to take time off from work to care for her, for your folks, for yourself, that there's paid family leave, and you're not punished by losing out on income or even your job for just doing what any human should be able to do. I want to make sure that women in this country who are paid 80 cents on the dollar for what men are paid in this country, that African American women who are paid 61 cents on the dollar, Latinas 53 cents on the dollar, that there's no discrimination in the workplace that further compounds the inequity and inequality that we have in this country, that we ratify the Equal Rights Amendment so that is enshrined in our Constitution. It's never a question. Again, I want to repeal the worst excesses of the Trump tax cuts. Those people of the future, when they look back on 2017 and 2018, they will not be able to believe that at a moment that we were $21 trillion in debt, when we were fighting wars in half a dozen countries around the world, when we had $4 trillion in outstanding infrastructure needs, tens of millions of our fellow Americans who could not get health insurance, that our answer to that was $2 trillion of tax benefits to the wealthiest Americans and to corporations that were already sitting on record piles of cash. That corporate tax rate went from 35% down to 21%. Even if we don't take it all the way back up to where it was, but take it to the mid-20s, we will generate hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 10 years. We could invest that in universal pre-K, starting education not at 4 or 5 years old, but 3 or 4 years old, ensuring that there's a greater likelihood that that child will graduate from high school, go on to earn higher education, or join a union and achieve their full potential over the course of their lives. And then lastly, you mentioned wealth. We do a decent job of taxing income. We could do a better job by taxing income from capital at the same rate that we tax income from work or labor. That would generate a lot of money, but we do a poor job of taxing wealth. And back to this idea of ensuring that a political democracy is harmonized with an economic democracy. At the founding of this country, looking at the example that we fled, or many fled in Europe, where you had princes and princesses and dukes and duchesses, we didn't want that concentration of wealth. We knew it was inimical to our democracy and to this idea, this experiment of America. And yet we are creating that concentration right now that's on par of the worst that we saw in Europe during that age. So taxing that wealth so that it's not passed on unrestricted to the next generation and doesn't concentrate the inequality that we see in this country. 10 times the wealth in white America today than there is in black America today. And that is compounded by so many of the legacies of slavery and segregation, suppression, Jim Crow, redlining that are still alive and well in this country. Breaking up some of that wealth and making sure that it is invested in everyone's opportunity to succeed, to reach their full potential, to fulfill their promise. That is not just good, and it is not just fair, and it's not just morally the right thing to do. It perhaps is the only way to be able to save this democracy and ensure that it is up to the challenges that we just described today. Thank you for the question. Appreciate that. As told them, thank you all for having us out here today, for hosting us. Very, very grateful. Bryce and Kale, thank you.
Yes, no problem. And Mr. Rourke has to get to another event here shortly. So if you